Well, welcome back. We've got a number of people online, so we're happy to have you. It's a beautiful evening here in St. Louis. I think spring has sprung, so it's nice for that. So I'm 𝐀𝐦𝐞𝐫𝐢𝐜, the founder and head of school for Lafayette Academy. And as you all well know, we're supported by Hillsdale College as a curriculum school, and we are a K through 12 school. Next year, we are anticipating we will have 2 kindergarten classes. We're splitting classes. We've got a lot of growth happening, for which we're very grateful and excited. So before we get going tonight, I wanted to let you know of our upcoming gala, which some of you may know. This year, we're going to don our best in our Western gear, and we're going to enjoy the beautiful barn setting of 𝐏𝐻𝐬𝐽 Grove, which is in Defiance, and enjoy delicious barbecue, great music, lots of great friends, silent and live auction items, and a Fund the Future paddle race, all to benefit the students here at Lafayette. So tickets have just gone on sale, and if you're interested, that can be found at LafayetteAcademy.org. I also have some invitations for those of you who are here. And our theme this year is Dunkirk. It's called Project Dunkirk, We Are the Rescue Mission. And if any of you know a bit about your history with Dunkirk, the idea that the British soldiers were pushed to the edge there while the Nazis were bombing them, through Churchill's guidance, he authorized the people, the private little vessels, to come in and rescue those men off the shore and take them into safety. And as I thought about that, it occurred to me that this is kind of what we're doing with our own students here. Many are trying to escape the current feckless educational models that are out there, and we are, as a school, we are bringing those children in, we're bringing them into safety, we're giving them the tools that they need to be successful, and we are doing it. Just quick little story, we had a little guy who came to us who was in 2nd grade. He was reading at a kindergarten level this year in September. He's just been tested, and he's now in the middle of 1st grade, so he's actually advanced about 18 months in about 5 months. That is tremendous, and I don't think that would have happened anywhere else. So that's the kind of rescuing we're doing, and it betters him, but in the end, it betters all of us, and that's why we're doing it. So we hope you can join us for that really exciting event. So tonight, it's going to be a fun talk by Mr. Preston. This talk is the last one of the school year, and it's rooted in Mr. Preston's experience growing up in the 1960s. And while he was taught to admire the wisdom and the integrity of our founders, he was also captivated by the stories of great American inventors like Thomas Edison, and Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington Carver. His school days were filled with tales of Yankee ingenuity when he first encountered the now often debated phrase, thinking outside the box. So following his January presentation, if you were here for that, on Elon Musk, a timely discussion of a modern day Edison, it made sense to actually talk about something broader, talk about a broader perspective of American innovation and its long history of groundbreaking innovations and advancements. So tonight's talk isn't just about the latest viral trend or fleeting invention, but instead we're going to explore true stories, some very well known, some not so well known, and reveal the profound and lasting impact of American ingenuity on the modern world. His talk is titled Innovations, America's Role, Past, Present, and Future. So it's time for liftoff. Please help me welcome Mr. Preston.
Thank you, Mrs. McKinney. I am going to take this opportunity to make a little connection there with our gala and its Dunkirk theme. It came to mind, as history guys, it always does, and I'm sure there's a couple of my friends out there that know what I'm talking about. One of the amazing things to me about the time of Dunkirk was when Churchill called for all good men in Britain who might have any kind of boat to head over to Dunkirk to try to rescue as many men as possible, because you can replace tanks and guns and artillery, but it takes 18 years to grow a human being. And so a flotilla of boats left England to save some of these people. And one of the first talks, history talks I ever gave, because it was something I've been fascinated about all my life, was about the Titanic. And one of the men who used his personal boat and ran it, I think 5 times back and forth, was the senior surviving officer from the Titanic. His name is Lightoller. I think he was 2nd officer. And he went back and forth that day. And it had not been an easy life for him, being the highest ranking survivor of the most famous shipwreck of all time. And on the last time when he came back after bringing a bunch of guys to the Titanic, as he tied up the boat, it sank down to the bottom of wherever he tied up the boat because it was full of holes. So that's the kind of men that were involved in Dunkirk, and we're going to save our educational system in this country. And your support of Lafayette Academy is important to that. So everybody that's on tonight, that's the greater good story that we have here is saving American education. All right, let's get to our subject. There's lots to talk about today. I gotta say the most. Go ahead.
I just want to make sure this little box
It says unmute myself, right? And I've talked to somebody online and say they can hear me. So if you can't hear me, make sure to let somebody else know, and we'll get that taken care of. Anyway, so you got a thumbs up. Okay. I don't know how to get that off. I tried to run my handy dandy little thing over here, and I can't seem to take that off. So anyway, I'm not going to worry about it because I don't think they can see that and they can't see that online anyway, right? Okay, so the biggest challenge for this particular time, this is a lot of fun. And it brought back a lot of memories, and it's always fun to get into it. Every time I prepare something, I learn something myself. But what was particularly interesting was deciding which things to keep. There was so much to go to. And also, it brings on deeper thoughts. Why has so much of this happened here in this country? And I even go back to colonial days. You can see that. And I came up with my own thoughts, okay? So this is just my own personal thoughts as to why this happens. And let's see if I can get this to work here. It's making me, there we go. Okay, so ambitious people are the ones who came to this new world, as they call it. And they saw, especially once we became the United States and the way we set things up here, that we were a haven for people who thought differently. Freedom of thought supports the crazy ideas that some of these people were coming up with. They were breaking the rules of the time with some of these possibilities. I remember the first time, going to go back to Elon Musk a little bit. The first time I heard him say, well, what we really need to do to save money is to land the boosters back. I said, yeah, that's going to happen. I didn't, there's just no way. I remember in one of the early Mercury flights, the poor pilot was like 200 miles off from where you're supposed to land, and it was a short mission. So here we are landing boosters on these little, I can watch it on my computer now. It's just the freedom of thought that's in this country and the support of that. As Mrs. McKinney said, the outside the box thought. Also, we are at our heart a capitalist system. And that means that we've got investors out there who are always looking to invest in what we call, venture capital. Most people say, well, that won't work. I'm not going to put my money there. But other people say, look, it may or may not work, but if it does work, wow, will this be successful? And if you get deeply into someone like Elon Musk's story, there's one particular time I talked about in there was, I've either got to save Tesla or I've got to save SpaceX. I can't save them both. And I'm going to figure out a way to save them both. And it's just an amazing story, typical of the kind of stories you hear in the United States. And remember, also, we had some of our founders who were inventors. Benjamin Franklin was an inventor. Thomas Jefferson was an inventor. You had new ways of medicine that were being tried by people like Benjamin Rush. So it's kind of part of our, and I know this is probably an overused phrase, our national DNA, to be innovators, to be creative, to take chances, and to be willing to fail. But maybe you learn something from that failure and the next thing's happening. This most recent flight, which once again in the news, all you see is all these blown up pieces of the Starship. And I remember years ago when Musk was first starting SpaceX, he says, we learned more from each failure than we did with most of our successes. And that's the way innovators think. And so a lot of what we're going to be talking about in here are maybe guys who maybe aren't the first one that came up with the idea, but someone else had maybe thought of the idea. They thought of a different way to do it, and they just stayed with it until they figure out a way to make it work. Also, what's interesting about the United States is there's support for this in our founding document. It's actually in the Constitution to have, under Article 1, Section 8, under Congress control, is to promote the progress of science and the useful arts by securing for limited time to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. The Patent Office is a result of this section of the Constitution of the United States, and that means it's part of the supreme law of our land. So again, we have protection for these kinds of things in our country, and that's why you see the kind of discoveries and foundings that you see. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin loved inventions. You have to understand, Ben Franklin at a relatively young age in those days retired early. He sold a lot of his holdings in the publishing business and the newspaper business, and he turned his attention to things that interested him. And he was kind of a rich, Musk-like tinkerer with things. You know, what is that bolt up in the sky? Maybe that's electricity. You know, what are some of these other things? And what I'm showing you here are some of the things he came up with. One at the top left is a kind of clock that he would try different ways of looking at time, dividing it up into minutes and seconds and hours. On the bottom is the very famous Franklin stove, which I always thought was the potbelly stove, but it's not. And it's this boxy kind of stove here on the bottom, and what makes it special is you cook on the top, and at the same time the whole thing keeps the room warm, and there's a way to vent it out of there so you don't get suffocated. And his experimentation on the bottom right there on how to make, once he discovered, yeah, lightning's electricity, all right, and it can be a problem. So here's how you make sure it doesn't hurt your home. You set up a first lightning rod to set the grounding into the ground so that it doesn't take out your home. So all the experiments that he does at this point in time, bifocal glasses, another thing he said, there ought to be a way to have regular glasses to see distance and then have a way to be able to read things. So I'll cut them in half and I'll put them together and bifocals come out of that. So he loved tinkering on things. He invented the first odometer that you could walk along, and the way that you would walk, you would be able to tell how far you'd walk. Just loved all that kind of stuff. So Franklin is often referred to as the first American, and right off the bat, he's looking at all sorts of inventions. Another unsung hero in my mind is Eli Whitney. Now, most people know Eli Whitney is the guy that invented the cotton gin, and there's all sorts of things to talk about that. I've just been going through that in the last couple of months with my middle schoolers, and how cotton is going to have a big important effect on what's going to happen in this country. The whole idea behind it is there's got to be a way to remove the seeds from the cotton, because the outside of a cotton seed, the short stable cotton, has like a Velcro-like surface. And you used to have slaves just sitting around all day pulling the seeds out of the cotton. So in the end, it might take a slave all day to just clean out the seeds of maybe 2 pounds of cotton. Remember, it looks like a lot, but it doesn't weigh a lot. And the cotton gin, which is short for engine, found a way to force it through these forks that would force the seeds out of the cotton. The seeds would come out the end, which you're going to later on use to plant more cotton, and the lint falls in the bottom, and here you've got clean cotton. Now, his thought was, hooray, you won't need slaves to do this work anymore. And the law of unintended consequences instead had people, gee, if I can have slaves just cleaning cotton all day, then I can plant all kinds of cotton and grow tons of the stuff and get really rich. So he had hoped that it would make slavery obsolete. Unfortunately, what it did is it showed, as David McCulloch says in the Civil War series, it shows the South how to make cotton paid, and that's how it became King Cotton. But he also has a second important part in American history. When John Adams was president of the United States in 1798, 1799, we were in an undeclared war with France, and they were afraid that it might become a declared war. And one of the things that we knew is we didn't have enough arms for an army if we needed to raise an army to fight the French. So he made a proposal to Eli Whitney, who was considered kind of the genius of his day. You know, can you figure a way to make enough muskets for our army for this war that we might have in France? And he came up with something which you kind of see an exploded view down here in the bottom, which he called the uniformity system. You would take the pieces of a musket, of a rifle, whatever it was, you'd pull it apart, and you'd have something make all those parts together. Rather than have each one crafted by hand by a gun maker, you'd have some sort of tool and die manufacturer that would make each individual parts. Then you have a box with each of those parts, and along the way, people would pass the being built musket, and each person would over and over add the parts from their box. It's assembly line, but they didn't call it that. He called it the uniformity system. So he had a contract for 10,000 guns. He got about 3,000 made when suddenly it became obvious that we weren't going to fight the war with France. But it's something to stay tuned about, because in the end, we are going to use that system. So it's Eli Whitney. You don't get Henry Ford without Eli Whitney, is basically what we're saying here. In the early 1800s, suddenly you start getting this blizzard of inventions having to do with machinery. So get the War of 1812 out of the way. We had a really bad depression after that. As the 1820s and the 1830s starts to happen, Americans are looking for solutions for the labor problem that continues to happen, especially in the North. You're not going to, all the northern states had banned slavery. So how are we going to get our fields taken care of? How are we going to be able to move food around in some of these areas? Jacob Perkins in 1834 is the first one to come up with the idea of, if we have a way to compress these different gases that we have, we can find a way to compress and uncompress and run a fan, and refrigeration is invented. Now, it's going to take a while before that's going to be portable enough to use, but eventually that's going to lead to refrigeration, it's going to lead to air conditioning, all these things. So discovering refrigeration, Jacob Perkins, 1834. Samuel Colt is the first one to come up with the idea of a drum with bullets in cartridges that will rotate with the machinery each time you pull back the hammer on a revolver. So Samuel Colt's invention, which you see at the bottom there, is his patent for it, that he invents in 1836. Cyrus McCormick's Reaper, which you see in the middle picture there, in 1837. You can have a lot more of your field reaped if you have that machine. At this point in time, it's going to be pulled by a horse. So we're not really at gasoline engine type of things here. But even that, you look at how wide a swath that will reap, so you can get a lot more of your field done than if you just have as many people you can bring in from your friends. And the thresher that Hiram Moore invents does the same thing for different kinds of fields. Samuel Morse's telegraph. Look at all these things all at the same time, 1834, 1836, 1837. And as people are doing this, they're also advertising that they're making these things. So you start seeing advertisements. You start saying, I want to see one of these. You start getting your own ideas. A machine that will do that. Ooh, that's a neat idea. People would buy that if I can make something that will replace the labor of a couple of different people. So Samuel Morse's telegraph in 1837, which is really simply nothing more than opening and closing an electrical circuit. But that makes all the difference, because you can do long distance communication that way. In 1844, Mr. Goodyear discovers vulcanized rubber, that if you treat it with heat, that will last a lot longer. And now you can start thinking about, well, if you put that over a tire, or put that over a wheel, it will last a lot longer. Of course, when we get automobiles, that'll be huge. But it happens in 1844. And Elias Howe's sewing machine. Anybody out there a Beatles fan? The end of Help is funny, because at the end, they give a dedication of the film to Elias Howe for inventing the sewing machine. Well, I think it's just their sense of humor, but I never forgot that when I saw that in the theater. So why Elias Howe, and who was he? And oh, he invented the sewing machine. And many of these things are going to just kind of start going when it's going to get interrupted by the Civil War in the 1860s. After the Civil War, all of these things are going to start to be mass produced, and you'll lead to even more inventions. And we'll see that coming down the road here. And one of my favorites is Elisha Otis, who invents the elevator brake. I remember growing up always seeing Otis down there on the floor of the elevator, and I think, oh, it's an Otis elevator. No, he didn't invent the elevator. What he did was much more important. He invented a reliable brake. Until you had a reliable brake, you were taking your life in your hands every time you got in an elevator. You were assuming that the rope wouldn't break and you wouldn't plummet to your death. And so people say, you want to take the elevator? No, thanks, I'll take the stairs. And when Elias Howe came in and invented the elevator brake that was flawless, and in order to demonstrate it to people, later on after the war, when he started producing it in numbers because skyscrapers were starting to happen, he demonstrated at a place called Machinery Hall, a centennial exhibition in 1876. And he would have helpers that would put him on a platform that would go about 3 or 4 floors up. And then he's up there and he's waving and talking to people, says, watch this now, this is gonna change everything forever. And one of his assistants would cut the rope and he'd start plummeting and people were screaming. And he pulled the lever on his elevator brake and it stopped. And he says, I wasn't worried about it because I know how good my elevator brake was. Great salesmanship. Okay? That's another thing of Americans. We learned how to market these ideas when we started coming up. All right, Alexander Graham Bell. Most of you know him as the guy who invented the telephone, but there's a lot of things that he did. And in fact, keep an eye on this because one of his legacies is going to be what we call Bell Laboratories. And Bell Laboratories is going to be very involved in the inventions that we're going to see later on in the 20th century. So why was he doing this? He's known for the telephone, but he was working on sound ideas because his wife was deaf. And he's thinking, maybe if I can get something that has a sound, she can put her hand on it, she can feel the vibrations or something like that. So a lot of his work in the early days was trying to get something to help her. And then he also realized it obviously could be a communication device. And so that's when the famous spilled something on my hand, Watson, come here, I need you happens, and I heard you in the other room. He also invented other things. He invented the first metal detector, all right? And there's a story here about how that came to be and how it became a big deal. So in 1881, James Garfield's president of the United States, and he's shot in a train station by a deranged man. And for months, poor Garfield is going on. They're trying to find the bullet to get him out because it's causing him to be pretty ill and endangering his life. And he was able to put his metal detector underneath the gurney that the Garfield was on, and they could see where the bullet was. Unfortunately, once they found out where the bullet was, they knew they couldn't get it out without endangering his life. And he did eventually pass on, but it did show that his device worked. The autopsy proved that it was exactly where the image they had gotten from using the metal detector was. He also invented what was known as the photophone. That's funny. He invents the telephone. That's what we know him for. But the photophone, he felt, was his greatest invention. So what is a photophone? A photophone allows you to speak, and a light beam would go to a receptor, and the sound would come out there. Okay, and so he said, this is amazing. This is my greatest invention. The problem was there wasn't really a use for that because at that time, you had to be in line of sight. Well, if you're in a line of sight, you probably don't need to really be yelling through a telephone. What it eventually did is when they figured out that you could make a clear cable out of glass, or as we call it, fiber optics, that's when the invention of this photophone really came into being. Was the photophone eventually is what leads us to say, well, what if we had, a clear thing and we could compress the signal? And next thing you know, we've got fiber optics. So it's a big deal. I know my internet is a fiber optic system there. And so thank you, Alexander Graham Bell. And the graphophone, which was kind of a read-write thing. You'd write something here, the wire would take it, and there was a pen on the other side that would reproduce the writing. It was cool, but in the end, it didn't really have a great application. And so, I got to get to class, I'm sorry. So that didn't take off. But again, it was another thing he come up with. And finally, the first audiometer, which was there to test your hearing and give an idea, what are the frequencies that you're having problems with? What frequencies do you hear really well? And again, out of his interest in trying to benefit his wife, he invented the first audiometer to test people's hearing. All right. Now, those of us who grew up in the same generation as some of my friends who are sitting here, we remember going to a little film called The Graduate when we were young people. And there's a wonderful scene in there where a young man's trying to decide what to do after he's graduated from college, and he's got an older guy that comes up to him and says, I have one word for you, Benjamin Plastics. And the fact of the matter was the generation that went through the mid part of the 20th century was all about plastics. The first plastic invention of plastics, was John Wesley Hyatt in 1869, when he invented what we call celluloid. And the early motion picture films were made on celluloid. And the whole idea behind celluloid was to replace billiard balls, which were made out of ivory at that time. So that meant, a lot of elephants were getting killed in order to make billiard balls out of them. That wasn't terribly popular with some people. So what if we have another way to do it? So John Wesley Hyatt got a $10,000 prize for inventing a billiard ball made out of celluloid. One problem with celluloid, it's very flammable. And so, early films, you may remember, if you're watching an old film, all of a sudden it'll catch on fire and then you got to put it out and that sort of thing. So it wasn't really practical until Leo Bakelite came along and invented what we call Bakelite. And Bakelite is the kind of plastic that most of the times, it's different things now, but what you're sitting on is basically a different version of Bakelite then. And it replaced most woods. You could stain it, you could make all sorts of colors in it, so it looked, what we would say is a faux wood stain or something like that. So after World War II in particular, when that was over and consumer goods were big again, Bakelite is what most plastics were made out of at that time. So that was really a big invention. Again, these are all Americans seeing a problem, saying, what if we could do this? Or what if I had something that was cheaper that would go that way? Again, the capitalism part of it is a really important part of it. All right, here's the guy that I was told to revere when I was a young man. I think it was Spencer Tracy who played him in a famous film about Thomas Edison. Since then, we've read biographies about, he would take all the inventions that the guys who worked for him make and then claim them in his own, all that sort of stuff. I'm not going to get into that whole thing. All I know is that once he started getting his inventions going, he kind of did what we kind of tend to do today, which is we set up a group of people whose job is to solve certain problems or come up with certain ideas, or do some brainstorming and see what kind of things they can come up with. So the Wizard of Menlo Park, his most famous quote was, how do you invent things? Where do you get your inspiration from? And he said, inventing is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. Once he got successful with his light bulb, he used the proceeds from that to set up his own invention factory, and he brought in all the smart guys that he could. So he invented the first phonograph, he invented the kinetoscope, which was an early version of motion pictures. He invented the alkaline battery, the storage battery we called it at that time. He made a lot of improvements to Bell's telephone, and he had hundreds of patents that he took out all in his name, since it was his factory. And then, of course, one of the famous things that happens later in his life was when he has a battle with Nikola Tesla, who's even more well-known because of the car manufacturer, the electric car. But Tesla's a guy who came from another country, came to the United States, and they're having a battle. Edison wants to go with DC, which is direct current. The problem is direct current, he has shorter distance that you can transmit electricity on, whereas Tesla comes up with alternating current, which with proper transformers and stuff, you can cover a whole city pretty easily. One thing that Edison was really good at, he was a really master promoter. And so he was constantly talking about the things he was working on, and I know inspired many generations. And eventually his company became known as General Electric. And for years and years, it was one of the big dogs in Wall Street. All right, powered flight. There you go, America again. And we were just having a discussion right before this talk tonight about this whole situation, particularly the competition between the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur here, and Curtiss Wright. I'm sorry, what's his first name again? I forget. Anyway, Mr. Curtiss, who at the same time, they're dueling each other. And it was mainly through perseverance in picking the location for where they were going to try their powered flight, which was at Kitty Hawk, where the winds are constant, as opposed to Curtis was focused on catapulting his flyer and had problems with his catapult. But the picture that you see down here at the bottom is the famous picture of the first powered flight that they were able to say, okay, definitely this, it came off the skids, got help from the winds. They used cables to bend the end of the wings there, and the Wright brothers get credit for being the ones. And think about this. This is a very American story. You got two guys from Dayton, Ohio. Where? Dayton, Ohio. Yeah, it's just north of Cincinnati. I grew up in Cincinnati, so I remember Dayton very well. In fact, the big Air Force base up there is Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Anyway, and they're bicycle repair guys, basically. A bike shop, and they repair and stuff like that. So they're fascinated with flight. And so it's a very American story. We need to get this piece here. We're going to change this piece here. And they have the machinery to make their own parts if they need to, and the trial and error, and a number of times they went there before they finally got it to work. And their fascination with this is something can be done. This is a time period where people thought, you guys are crazy if you think you can do this, and you'll probably kill yourself. In fact, I think it's Orville that almost did die. He does have a crash later in life, and he stops flying. But the fact of the matter is that they went all over the world. It wasn't just, okay, we did it, we proved it. They went all over the world showing their flying machine and demonstrating that powered flight was possible. Think about this. This happens in December 1903. 11 years later, airplanes are in World War I. That is very quick. Even more fun. A little over 50 years later, people are walking on the moon, and it's the same people. It's Americans who are walking on the moon. So it's really kind of amazing to see the transition that goes on there and the progress. Eventually, they did merge with their competitor, Curtiss, and that company became known as the Curtiss-Wright Corporation, who made some airplanes during World War II, as I recall. All right. Modern conveniences, and that's kind of the invention. These are the wild ideas. Now there are some things. What about consumer goods? And this, again, is a very American idea. What will make life easier for people? And one of the guys who comes up with a great idea, this will make life easier for people, is Willis Carrier, who invents air conditioning. And having spent 8 years in Florida, I can assure you there would not, and you know, there would not be people living in Florida if it were not for air conditioning. Because from, I'd say, April to October, you go from your air-conditioned house to your air-conditioned car to your air-conditioned office building, and be careful to put carpet on your steering wheel so you don't burn your hands. So without air conditioning, it wouldn't have happened. So after air conditioning starts becoming more and more frequent, it changes everything. I remember, I was old enough to remember when you go to a movie theater and they'd advertise, we are air conditioned, because in the heat of the summer, let's go see a movie, it's just too hot tonight. Philo Farnsworth, who is down here at the bottom, his picture there, who is the creator of television. Now, to me, I can't get a lot into the story, obviously, because we only have so much time, but I want to tell you a part of the story. So for years and years, he does this. He had battles on his patents with RCA, Victor, and eventually settles with them, but he keeps making it better and better. For the most part, even though it was invented in 1927, it's the post-war time when we've really got a beginning of a consumer economy in the United States, and people are thinking, what do I want to watch television for when I can listen to radio, and there's a little tiny screen, but the screen started getting bigger, and radio stars started getting on television. And poor Philo Farnsworth was not happy about it and told his wife, you know, I am sorry I ever invented. That's true. He did say that until he watched Neil Armstrong walking on the moon live on television. And he turned to his wife. This is a true quote. This is what she said. He says, it was all worth it, which I think is kind of cool. Don't you think that's kind of cool? I think that's kind of cool.
It was 40 years.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's great that he was still living at that time, got to see that. I got to see his invention broadcast, the live video of a man walking on the moon. And it also tells you how quickly this all happened. Henry Ford's Model T, of course, again, you might say it is and it is not invention, but the fact that he kept coming up with creative ways to be able to make it faster, make it cheaper. My favorite part about the Ford Model T was it comes in any color as long as it's black. But taking all these other inventions and applying it to this consumer good, and then keeping his goal that he wanted to make sure that he made it cheap enough so that even a Ford worker on the assembly line could afford to buy a Model T. And that's its own kind of invention, the mass production. And then the mass production of penicillin for usage in World War II is something that it was an American invention. I didn't get a lot. There's a lot. We're going to get into an area now. We're going to see more and more clumps of people. And you'll say, well, who's the inventor of that? So, well, this group did that, and this guy did this part, and this person did this part. So we're going to get more and more of that as we go in here. I wanted to take a little moment, because I mentioned him, made sure to mention him in the introduction, to talk a little bit about George Washington Carver, because I remember very distinctly hearing about him when I was growing up. And I remember not too long ago, there was a comedian who was having fun about that, and it was joking about, George Washington Carver was just trying to figure out how to take a peanut and make a phonograph needle or something like that, and everybody laughed because we'd heard of 8 million uses for a peanut that were discovered by George Washington Carver. But the fact of the matter, he's really an amazing story. Born in Missouri, I didn't know that until I started looking into his history. He was a professor at Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute for about 35 years. And of course, what he was involved in was mainly agriculture. He was trying to save the South from what cotton production for decades and decades had done to the soil there. So what he's inventing is, okay, how do we find a way to return some of these nutrients back to the soil? And through his work, his experimentation and practices, he found out that peanuts would do that, and sweet potatoes would do that. So I don't know if he necessarily goes into the inventor stage, but I certainly think it's his innovation aspect of George Washington Carver that makes him important. And also advertising at the same time doing that, rotate it. You're going to have beans in this area, and then in the next year you're going to put corn in there, and then next year you're going to put peanuts in there, and then next year you're going to put sweet potatoes. So rotation to revitalize the soil. And the numerous uses that he had for crops. So I just felt George Washington Carver deserves a spot here in our Hall of Fame. All right, modern technology. Okay, I gotta say honestly, boy, did I have to do a lot of research on some of this, because sometimes it's hard for me. I am not an information technology guy. I've got a son who is. And so a lot of times I read all these things and I go, gosh, I wish I'd taken physics, and I didn't. But anyway, some of these technological advances, almost all of them are coming in the United States. And there's different reasons for that. The first acknowledged computer right here in the middle is the ENIAC computer, was at the University of Pennsylvania in 1946, and basically what they are is fancy schmancy calculators at that point in time. But they're doing a lot of them, and they're doing them faster than having human beings in there. And if you think of that, carrying that in the palm of your hand and making a phone call these days, you realize how far we've come. In 1945, Perry Spencer noticed that microwave radiation actually made things heat up. And he thought to himself, hey, maybe there's a way to turn that into something. So that's him at the top there. And on the right is the first microwave that he designed, the radar range. Some of you may remember the early radar range. And so that was going to be important, certainly, once we had people in the 1970s and 1980s who were taking their kids to sports practice and need to come back and heat something up really quickly for dinner. Jonas Salk's polio vaccine down the right-hand side there. That was a huge innovation that made all the difference. I'm probably one of the last, our generation is probably the last one that still has our little spots on our arms, because it was required there in the 1950s, the 1960s. But after what people had seen during that period of time, it was a big deal when that happened. And here's one that I think is kind of fun. Theodore Maimon's laser. That's the guy who's down at the bottom there, the two guys taking a look at the laser beam there. And I remember it was kind of one of those things like, can you spell anti-disestablishmentarianism? Do you know what LASER stands for? And LASER stands for light amplification through stimulated emission of radiation. And at that time, it was just one of these, wow, can't believe something like that. Someday there'll be death rays and things like that. Fortunately, for the most part, we don't have death rays. But it does give us something to torture our cats with, and we keep on the end of our keychain. So that's kind of fun to make sure that we have something as important as that in our culture today. All right, the biggie, the atom bomb. The thing I find most interesting about the atom bomb, and the film about Oppenheimer is an interesting film, but it leaves a lot out as far as the history I'm concerned. What I find most interesting when you look at the history of the Manhattan Project and the atom bomb is that it was really an international effort. Most of those head scientists came from somewhere else, but where did they come to be able to put this together? Where did they come to be safe? Where did they come to get the financial? So $2 billion was a lot in those days. Remember, when the atom bomb project starts in 1943, the Depression was still very much a strong memory. In fact, what ended the Depression was World War II. It was not the New Deal programs, but it was World War II. So it's an international effort. We're trying to bring in people from all over the world. They came to the United States to become part of the Manhattan Project, and the freedom to allow them to make mistakes, to throw out ideas. In a lot of other cultures, you don't want to be wrong. Once you're wrong, they'll never listen to you again. So a lot of times you clam up, don't say something. Not in America. Not in the United States. What if we tried this? Okay, let's try that problem and work it out. The support they would get as a group, and finally the facilities that the United States was willing to put into this, and of course, as I said, the financial support of $2 billion. There was no other place in the world. Thankfully, the Nazis did not get the bomb, and one of the main reasons they didn't, because they had a pretty good scientist too. Heisenberg was one of the scientists in the German program, was that you did not have that kind of culture. You did not want to make mistakes. You did not have openness of thought. There was paranoia that you had to deal with. And so the people who came here to work on the Manhattan Project knew that there was no place in the world where they're going to be able to do it. And once they got it, they used it to end the war. I think it's really interesting. And of course, it's one of those things that makes us nervous once in a while. But we got it in 1945. We used it twice. No one has used it since. And when I used to get involved with people who were debating, should we have dropped the bomb, should we not have dropped the bomb, and you can go on to that. But in the end, one of the things that came out of it, and it's sad that it came out this way, but it's also helpful to know, is that people saw how horrific it is and decided it shouldn't happen again. And let's hope that 80 years later, we don't have it happen again. All right, now more fun. The transistor. The transistor is a result of work by William Shockley, John Bardeen, and Walter Brenton, and that happens at Bell Laboratory, Alexander Graham Bell's legacy. 1956, they received the Nobel Prize for Physics because it was considered one of the most important inventions of the 20th century. And it also helped the Japanese invent the whole industry. Again, those of us who grew up in that time, the number of people you would see with a little transistor radio in one hand, a little one single earbud in the side. I look at the kids today with the Apple Pods, and I'm like, you are so lucky we got that thing we had to stick in there, and it sounded terrible, and it was AM, and crackle, crackle, crackle. But not only to invent that industry, but you don't get the rest of electronics without the transistor first. So, I don't know what, okay, it's probably hard to see there. This at the top says, the internet. And no, it's not Al Gore. Okay, that's my Al Gore joke. It's invented from ARPANET. And the idea behind it was to connect computers, particularly all over the United States. But over time, eventually they're thinking when we get more international connections, it obviously can go outside of the United States. And the idea behind it was defense purposes. What if we had a nuclear war or some sort of war that shut down our telephone system? We got to be able to communicate somehow. And the way to do that is to communicate directly from computer to computer to talk to each other. And so eventually ARPANET gets folded into DARPA, which is the defense equivalent of that Defense Department. And so for years, it was the Department of Defense that used the most. Mostly it was government that used in those days. Then in the 1990s, it begins to get a little popularity. Those of us who know AOL, if you've ever watched 𝐀𝐤𝐞𝐫𝐢, it makes you laugh now when you think about it, the little screech that you'd hear on dial-up or something like that. You had public discussion boards. Those of us who grew up at that time remember Prodigy was Sears, CompuServe was big, and it was a way to talk to people all over the country and maybe even all over the world. And then what really changed the internet was when the Mosaic browser was invented in 1991, and the World Wide Web became part of the internet. But it all starts in the, I think it's 1969. I haven't got the thing blocked here. From ARPANET, it started during that time. All right. This is, believe it or not, the first personal computer. It's John Blankenbaker's 𝐾𝐦𝐿, okay? Only 50 were made. It was made in 1971. You see this little sign on top of it advertising the fact that it was the first personal computer. So you ask, what did it do? Not much of anything. You could use these buttons to put in numbers and then press give me a result, and it would give you the proper numbers back through the light system at the top of that. But it was something that you could have. It was something into a computer for you. And they only made 50 of them. It didn't go anywhere. But those people who were in the personal computer business said, there's no question about it, that was the first computer. So it's just lights signifying computation. And you can see why someone would look at that time and say, well, this is never going to fly. But once again, Americans are going to take that and say, yeah, but we can do something else with it. So you have people like Radio Shack, and you have Commodore 64, and you have the Apple II. I remember first the personal computer I ever saw, we got an Apple IIe, just basically to type things up, because we didn't want a typewriter, and you could cut and paste. Oh, this is the greatest thing in the world. So all these things, it died in 1973. In other words, 50 of them, they didn't make any more. But it's nothing but lights and buttons. But that gets things started. Whenever you have someone come up with a new creation, somebody else says, you know what they should have done? They should have done this. And then now they're making this new part that I can put in here. And that's what's going to happen in all these different areas, okay? The next big invention is the integrated circuit. And this is the first integrated circuit you see here. It's in a museum. It was invented in 1958. The first idea about it came from a guy in Britain named Jeffrey Dummer. And that's not fair, but anyway, that's his name. But he came up with the idea, so there ought to be a way to be able to take a board that's not going to, be at all conductive, and you can put things on it and it will make these things happen faster. That's the best I can do to explain it. So instead of all these wires and transistors and diodes and everything, it'll all go on this one board and put it all on one silicon board. And I remember I spent a lot of time, about a week or so, why silicon? Why silicon? And silicon is a low number of, it's at 14 on the periodic board, and for whatever reason it's a small enough molecule, and it's perfect for the kind of things they want to have it do. And so that's how we eventually are going to have all these things made, and they're going to be made in California, around places like San Francisco, because places like Stanford have got all the brain power that's going to come with these things, and that's how you get Silicon Valley. The first patent on the integrated circuit was Robert Noyce in 1961. Also at the same time, a guy named Jack Kilby of Texas Instruments came up at the same time, so they kind of share, some extent, the patent on that. And there you go again, Texas Instruments. Texas Instruments at first started saying, we can put these things inside a little thing, and we can have a little calculator, all that sort of thing. And that's how TI got involved. And of course, like I said, that's why it's called Silicon Valley, because of all these silicon chips out there. All right, the first microprocessor. Wow, I'm gonna be late for class. The first microprocessor, this job was to process all binary instructions. That's what the definition said. I said, what does that mean? What that means is all these instructions are in zeros and ones. That's what binary is. And the way it puts those all together, it takes those proper batches of zeros and ones and comes out with a solution for whatever problem that you get into it. This is an actual picture of the first microprocessor, okay? And the men of Intel are the guys who invented, that makes sense then, invented the first microprocessor. And for decades, Intel dominated the microprocessor business. And as with most electronics, it's kind of a group discovery. But once again, this is one of those situations where some company in America says, you know, if we can figure out and solve this problem, I think we can make a lot of money. All right, we're going to put you smart guys over here, and you're going to work on this. And then when you get it, Intel's going to sell a lot of them. One of my favorite parts of the movie, You Got Mail, is where she's going to shut down her little bookstore, and the character played by Gene Stapleton over there says, oh, don't worry about me. I'll be fine. I bought Intel at 6. And at that time, in the 1980s, everybody laughed because Intel was like 350 at the time or something like that. But Intel dominated the microprocessor business. So here are the 4 guys who are most often quoted as being the guys who are the inventors, or at least the developers of the microprocessor. And what I love about this again is America, okay? Look at those names. Not one of those guys is Native American. So that means at some point in time, all their lineage was from some other place on the planet. And at some point in time, they or their parents or their grandparents came to America. They got an education, they got a job at a place like Intel, and they end up being one of the guys who creates the microprocessor. That's the American story. All right, take off my, not running for office, but it sounds like it. Email. The guy you see on the left here is the guy who invented email, and I love the story about how this happened. Okay, his name is Ray Tomlinson, and he was working at ARPANET at the time, and they had him doing different things, and he's one of these kind of guys that could work on this, set that down, work on that. He's in a different group, they're working on something else, and he had been at MIT. And so he's a pretty smart guy. And he says, what if we could just send little messages to each other? Yeah, well, how are we going to do that? And remember, ARPANET is very simple. And he says, well, all you have to do is you have to address the machine that you want it to go to. Yeah, but I don't want anyone else reading what I have to say. Oh, well, then we'll have your name in there. Well, how are we going to do that? He says, well, since you're working at that company, you'll be Jim at Optimus Prime or whatever the name of your computer is. And so he's the one that comes up with the @ sign to identify the person at that particular server computer he's got. So at the time, he was an MIT graduate working at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, which comes up a number of times in a lot of these things that I was doing research on. They were big innovators at the time. And I remember after he invents this, and they're sending messages to different guys in this group, he says, don't tell anyone that we did this. And the guy says, why? He says, I was supposed to be working on something else. But he wanted to, he had a problem he wanted to solve. It was something fun to do. He wanted to be able to talk about his work with other colleagues. So he invents a way to talk with them that is just going to go to them specifically. Okay, they have to be able to sign into Bill at such and such to be able to read the email. So that's what I love about this story. Don't tell anyone we did this because I was supposed to be working on something else. The boss finds out, and of course, all he does is doom the post office and change the way everyone lives. Global positioning satellites, another American invention. And it's one of these things that comes out of the Defense Department, and for obvious reasons. You can't run cruise missiles. You can't have ships go to certain places. You need to be able to tell your planes where to land. You need incredible accuracy on all those things. So what they figured out early on is that if we put up a fleet of global stationary satellites, and we know exactly where those satellites are, then we'll be able to know triangulate the position of whoever is reading those signals. And so it took 24 satellites going up in order to make GPS, the global positioning satellites. I got a feeling it's more now, but they're not talking. But it changed for the rest of us because of a tragedy, okay? So for years and years, it was a secret, and it was kept by the Defense Department, and you can kind of understand it until in the 1980s, when the Korean airliner, Flight 007, was mistracked. It thought it was over international waters, and it was actually flying over Sakhalin Island, which was part of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union thought it was a American reconnaissance plane that was spying on them, and they ordered it to be shot down, which killed all the people on the airliner. So after KAL-007 shut down, shot down, I'm supposed to say. Then they said, you know, we really should allow this for civilian use. And so in the 1980s, you could start using GPS. Of course, how would we get anywhere these days if you couldn't punch it in? I mean, remember the old days? I know women do. Let's stop at a gas station, husband. No, I know where I'm going. No, they'll know where the gas station. I'm not stopping at the gas station. Now, when you just punch it in on your phone, you're good to go. Okay. So, the cell phone. Now, I remember reading recently, a guy was giving a talk about cell phones, and he put this picture up on the screen, and all the kids laughed. This was maybe 5, 8 years ago. This is from the movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas in it, and it was such a big deal at the time. I think it was 1986, 87, something like that, because this guy was so rich and powerful, he had a cell phone. Well, you know, we called it the brick, because it is like holding a brick. It's got that little thing about it. Well, mobile phones had been around for a while. Wealthy people had a chance to use mobile phones, but it was pretty much line of sight. So if you're in a city, there were dead zones everywhere in there because the buildings would block you off. And then somebody came up with the idea of cellular phone positioning. In other words, these two guys, Cooper and Mitchell, who worked at Motorola, and that's a Motorola he's holding his hand. I think it's called the 8008 or something like that. Anyway, they came up with that day and says, what if you put a bunch of cell towers all around, and all you need is the technology for when you're starting to leave one cell, then automatically the phone would look for another cell to connect through. And you can go through almost flawlessly without losing a connection. Now, we've all had cell phones drop out, but at least in its theory, that's the way it's supposed to work. And that's what happened. Passing the signal seamlessly from one tower to another. Now we just kind of expect it. Unless we look in there and go, uh-oh, I've only got one bar, I'm in trouble, okay? So each tower has its own cell. The Dynatac 8000 was what that was called. It was the first commercial one to be around, and that's Gordon Gekko, the character from Wall Street, who we saw using it, and you're thinking, boy, someday I'm gonna be so rich like Gordon Gekko, I'm gonna be able to have my own brick cell phone in my hand. And the real change then after that is when Steve Jobs says, why don't we take a cell phone and we'll put it with a web browser and we'll put it with an email receptacle and we'll call it the iPhone, and that's the invention of the smartphone. So once again, another situation where none of those are real inventions, but to say, let's figure a way to make this small enough and do the transistor work and everything so that we can get it all into one thing. And I don't know if any of you have seen pictures of the original iPhone. It kind of looks like, I don't know, a hockey puck or something like that. But in those days, you weren't worried about the battery. You weren't going to use it very much. I mean, but anyway, all that innovation eventually leads to what we all got used to, the smartphone. By the way, our smartphones what are doing the work that I was in the investment business in the 1980s, and there was a company called Cray Computers that used to produce these incredible, you know what I'm talking about, these incredible supercomputers that the National Security Agency used to break codes and listen to the conversations, stuff like that. Our smartphones today are stronger than those Cray computers were, the ones that we hold in the palm of our hand. And if I told you how powerful was the computer that got the men to the moon and then got them back, I mean, a 5-year-old's little plastic digital watch has got a chip that's 10 times more powerful than what they, that's why when you watch Apollo 13 and they're saying, just try to keep the Earth right in front there while you make your correction there or something like that, it's amazing that they will get there and back on the powers of the computers back in 1969. Now the things we have here, you can understand why we can do things like this. Whenever one's going up, I have to watch. I just never cease to be amazed. And not only that I watch what they're doing, but that I'm watching it as they're doing it. And that it's always on. And it's always on because Mr. Musk has got hundreds of little satellites who are picking up the signals. So you watch it constantly around there. And reusable rockets. Now, I'm not going to give my whole presentation on Elon Musk again, but I think it's worth reminding as we come to the close of this examination of innovation that Musk almost failed. He had enough money left from selling his PayPal stock when he set up SpaceX for 4 flights. First one never really got off the ground, blew up pretty quickly. The second one, same thing. The third one, a little better, lasted 2 or 3 minutes and then started spinning and blew up. And then the fourth one was either going to succeed or it didn't, and it succeeded. Okay? He was out of money after that. And that's the way things happen. People that take chances, and more amazing, they take chances on live TV. I am less amazed that the Starship has blown up the last 2 times than I am that the last time I saw it start tumbling live and go, uh-oh, this one's not going to go well. It was already tumbling, and I'm watching it, and I know something's wrong with one of the engines because it's tumbling. And, he didn't say, cut off the feed. It's there for everybody to see. We grew up at a time when the Soviet Union, you never knew whether they did anything. You found out about it later, or years later, you found out, oh, this guy died on this mission. We didn't even know he'd go up. We always broadcast our space flights live. Well, I was in Florida when Challenger went up, and that was live on TV. Same thing when we lost Columbia. So the main change with reusable rockets is that now you can save a ton of money. So after some failures trying to land these things, now it's also almost become kind of it's only going to be news if one of these fails. And I think there are 250 or something like that in a row without a failure. It's amazing. And this one on the bottom here is my favorite. The first one where they decided, well, we're going to land 2 right next to each other at the same time, which they did. And both of them are coming down with the sonic booms at the same time. And I'm looking at them and just going, I'm alive to see this, and it's really exciting to see. So there's one Falcon 9 booster that's on its 20th or 21st time being reused. That's just amazing. And then, of course, the Starship at the top right, we've got it now 3 times now. They've decided, okay, we're going to try the chopsticks, and it's 3 for 3 on the chopsticks. One time the pad wasn't ready, and so they just landed the booster out in the Gulf of America. But 3 for 3, I'll never cease to be amazed by that. I don't know if people really realize how big that thing is. They're catching the Statue of Liberty. That's what they're doing. And it's just amazing. If we'd caught a Saturn V, I think I would have lost it or something like that. But anyway, the whole idea is about getting the cost down. Okay, so I want to just tell you really quickly, because I didn't get into this last time, what's coming next. So eventually they're going to get to a point where they're going to have a unmanned mission to go around the moon. I'm talking about SpaceX. They're also going to start testing more and more of the Starships. Their next iteration, they're in Type 2 right now. Type 3 is supposed to be able to dock, because what you'll do is you'll put a booster in orbit, and you'll have another booster come up full of fuel, dock with it, add fuel to it, and you'll just keep doing that until it's full, and then you've got enough to take it to the moon and to have some fuel there, because they're going to look like the old style things that we used to think it was going to be like when you land this big space rocket on the moon. They said, no, we're going to land this little spidery bug thing on the moon because weight is everything. Well, once you start making things reusable and you save a lot of cost, you can start thinking about getting big things up into orbit and having them bring fuel up into orbit. And someday, when we start, and he's saying 6, 8 years, who knows? That's one thing he's not good at, is about his timing. You will start to have starships going to Mars. And the first ones will not be taking people. They'll be going there unmanned. And they'll be going there to drop off, here's some water, here's some fuel, here's some food, here's some machinery. And they'll have, Optimus type robots there will set everything up. Just like your hotel room is all set to go. And when we're ready to send men there, we know that they'll have a habitat all ready to go when they get there, rather than just have them take off and come back and that sort of thing. So it's really exciting to see what's next for the United States. Now, one of the big things that's going to happen, and we had somebody that tried to land, well, actually they landed, but it got in the side of a crater and fell over in its side. And so that's 2 times that machine has tried to get there. Everyone's trying to go to the South Pole. You're going to hear more and more people are going to the moon and they're going to the South Pole. Why are they going to the South Pole? Well, that's because there's water ice there. We have every reason to believe from what our sensors are telling us, there's water ice there. How could that happen? I remember when I first said that can't be. You've had eons of meteorites and comets and all sorts of things hitting the moon. And so they hit the moon, they spray stuff all over the place, and of course most of it's going to land on the surface, and the sun's going to hit it and instantly vaporize it. Except deeper craters in the South Pole of the moon, where for millions of years, no light has shone into the deep craters on the South Pole of the moon. You're looking from the South Pole at the deep craters in the South Pole of the moon. So we believe that there's water ice there. How much? That's why we're sending up these different little probes to see what's down there. And if we're right, it's more than just, oh good, they've got water. They don't have to launch water up there to stay there on the base of the moon. You also run electricity through that water, and you get hydrogen, you get oxygen, which you can use for rocket fuel. So this is going to, at some point in time, be Atlanta Airport. And the old joke being that when you die and go to heaven, you still have to connect through Atlanta. Well, this is going to be where you're going to connect through to go to Mars. You're probably going to do a first stage out here to the moon where they'll already have bases set up there. They'll already built up, some sort of rocket there. And it's a lot easier to launch a rocket off of the moon, which is 1/5 the gravity Earth, and go straight to Mars than it is to try to get it all up into Earth orbit and send it over to Mars. So at some point in time, that's going to be Atlanta's Hartsfield Airport for the space mission. So we'll also at some point in time be mining asteroids for metals. How are we going to do that? Keep your eye on those Optimus robots that Tesla's making and other companies are making all kinds of. You'll have those robots eventually will be working on these asteroids. They don't need food. They don't need water. You have any kind of source of electricity, whether it's solar or whether it's a small reactor or something like that, they just need to charge up. And there's all kinds of wonderful metals up there that we need, turning the lunar ice into both breathable air and rocket fuel. We're eventually going to have missile defense. They've got one in Israel, but Israel's a lot smaller place to defend. We're eventually going to need some sort of rocket defense in the United States. The technology, the speed of computation is getting so good now that they're going to get better and better at that. The Starlink global system is going to mean you're not going to have any dead zones. Already, I think it's T-Mobile has got connections there. You can, if you don't have bars on your phone, you can hook into Starlink. If you have, and I'm not advertising for T-Mobile. I'm pretty sure they're the first ones that are doing it. Someday, might we have cold fusion? In other words, you'll be able to get a lot of source of energy without having a dangerous radioactive elements you have to worry about. And the materials that we'll make in orbit, there are certain materials that if they're made in a weightless environment, we can make alloys and materials that you cannot make because the gravity on Earth causes them to separate. But if you can get them together in the right conditions in a weightless environment, they think that they can make some of these materials, and that will change things as well. So, and finally, we're going to need to find a way to make cheap electricity because the grid, we hear a lot about AI. Anybody seen the pictures of that big super setup that I guess Grok, which is X, which is Elon Musk, has set up in Memphis, Tennessee. I'm wondering at some point in time whether they're going to have a brownout in Memphis because those things suck up an amazing amount of electricity. So if we're going to have electric cars, we're going to have AI everywhere, things like that, we're going to need to have a better, hopefully cheaper and more plentiful source of electricity. And I think that's where you're going to see your next big innovations. And that is my presentation. Not too bad, an hour. Do we have questions?
So I'm curious, there's such a race right now that we've been hearing about with electricity, with AI, that we have to be first. What do you think they're seeing as potential threats? They're not being super vocal about that. What do you think
There are lots of threats. When you hear about the people who are very smart and very good at AI, there's differing viewpoints on that. You got some people say, oh, it's not really a threat. And then you have someone like Musk who says, probably 80% good, 20% not good. And so we have to make sure that we use the 80% to make sure the 20% doesn't happen. And then a lot of it is they just don't know. I guess the one thing I'd say about that is it's happening much faster than they thought it would, which is usually the other way around with innovations. You usually say, oh, I think we can do this, and then, for instance, I didn't think it'd be 50 years before we put another man on the moon. I'm sure Eugene Cernan, who was the last guy to step off the moon in 1972, I know, I saw him interviewed. I can't believe we haven't been back since then. And part of that, a lot of that's money. But the fact of the matter is that the AI, we're still figuring out, and there are different definitions of what that is. You know, is it just Google on steroids, or is it something else? I would say if you have an iPhone or an Android and you're interested in something like that, I know I've put Grok on my phone. That's the one that's X, which used to be Twitter, and the one that Musk is pushing all the time. And they've got several different voices in there that you can use. People are using ChatGPT to write business memos, to write, I know somebody who's using it to deal with delicate conversations on custody matters with an ex, all sorts of uses for it. But, you know, yes, one of the things you worry about is, does it have the kind of power to take a lot of your information and fool you about things? And we all have heard about phishing, when somebody's saying, you know, we're such and such bank and we got money for you. Every day I get, you know, you've got a refund from an insurance company. I guess it's the Nigerian prince thing of today. And I know that I don't, because I never did business with that insurance company that they're using. But, you know, they'll find more and more information about you, which we voluntarily give over the internet, which we should be really careful about doing. And it's easy to use AI to just kind of troll through the internet and look for that information, then put together something that really looks legitimate. If they're asking for your card or more information, or asking for your address, or, you know, saying you got some money coming or something like that, you know, do not respond to it. If you really think it might be legitimate, you find someone at that institution, you have a phone conversation. But that's not going to work eventually either, because they're going to start getting a really good voice imitation. I think recently I heard about somebody that had gotten a phone call, and they're absolutely certain it was a family member, and when I need this money right now, or else, and it was false. But they'd done a really good job of imitating that person's voice. That kind of stuff is creepy, no question about it. And we're going to have to demand that our government, because that's the only one that can really act on a big way on this, do something to control that. And all you got to do is start finding some of these people and put them in prison, and that'll stop. At least that particular one will stop. But yeah, it's a concern. The other side of the coin is it can change everything. I think the future of a combination of AI and the robotics that we're going to see in the future, and we hear all kinds of, you know, wild and crazy things about that, but I think where it'll really be helpful will be our generation as we get older, to have assistants around the house, to have, you've got a generation growing up right now which aren't having many children, which means they're not going to have many grandchildren. Right now, my grandson comes over and mows my lawn for me. I'd rather not do it anymore. I would if I had to, but who's going to do that for me if I don't have children and grandchildren? You know, maybe you've got your Optimus-style robot, and that sounds like science fiction. What it's probably ended up being is a lot closer to like all the other machines that we're used to using, from, you know, programming our thermometer to keep our house a certain temperature, or the dishwasher to wash the dishes a certain way, or the microwave and set it for a certain time. You know, it's a machine, and there's ways to restrict the abilities or knowledge of a machine in order to make sure that it stays good. But it does present at the same time, you know, for people who want to do something to do ill with. Hopefully I answered your question. I know I'm on a far field day. Anybody else? Do we have any questions online? Is there some way to find out if there's questions online or not?
Maybe, yeah.
Is that a little, is that what that is there? Yeah, I'm moving over to it. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
I apologize if I missed this, but do you have any thoughts on how intellectual property rights have affected innovation? Great question. We hear a lot about how timely, the tariff situation in Canada and Mexico. The real problem isn't Canada and Mexico, it's China. The Chinese have whole buildings full of hackers hacking into our systems. And the Chinese have been completely, I shouldn't say completely, generally ignoring international property rights. It's one of the biggest problems with China. And they produce so many materials that we buy, it's kind of like saying, okay, we don't care, or at least not enough to interrupt things with a problem. And so it is a big problem. Also from obvious from the standpoint of people not getting properly compensated. I know it's a big worry that Hollywood has. People aren't going to the movie theaters. They're watching things at home. You can find ways to watch those properties if you want to and get around paying for them through some services that are violating intellectual property rights. It's a concern because in the end, in a capitalist system, which we are, which the Chinese are in a quasi-capitalist system, you have to have rewards for the property generators to be able to finance their further innovation. Bell Labs, where did that money come from? Alexander Graham Bell, all those years, and able to hire all these guys to come in and discover all these things. Well, if those rights are violated, how is that going to change things? It's a real problem. So I think at some point in time, we're looking at a situation where the Chinese in particular are ones that have been ignoring that, and they're the big dog in the block. You may have read recently that they came up with their own AI, which of course they are advertising as this is better and it's cheaper and all this sort of stuff. Well, we don't know that. I always take everything they say with a grain of salt. Doesn't mean it's not true. It's just you start off doubtful and you're probably in good shape. But to think that they're not trying to do that, that's naive. And so if you have a major player in the world scene that is ignoring or intentionally violating international property rights, that will hurt innovation. Now, one of the things that's happened there is almost everything that they've done so far has been a Chinese version of something that's happened in the West. But and I'm not going to get too political about this, but we've had several administrations that have not guarded American property rights on Defense Department innovations, and the Chinese have taken full advantage of that. And they are determined to put a Chinese citizen on the moon before 2030. And I don't know if we're going to make that, 2030. I don't know if we're going to beat that. Right now, I think Artemis, which is our program, is in real trouble. And the question is, do they dare turn to Elon Musk and SpaceX, say, okay, you take the ball there? Politically, that might not be a very appropriate time to give him more to do just because politically. But probably they're more likely to get there. But the fact of the matter is, you're up against a very long, forward-thinking regime there in China, and they have no respect for anybody's international property rights, and I have a lot less also trust in them making moral decisions with what they do with their discoveries. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much. It's been really fun this year, and do some thinking over the summer if we want to do this again. We'll see. If you have any thoughts, please contact us, and please, we'd love to have your support here at Lafayette. The kids that we have here are just amazing. The last couple of weeks it's been really fun. The high schoolers are just come out of the New Deal, and we're about to go into World War II, and they come back from break, and they're such great, sharp kids. And I got 27 kids. I got a new one we're bringing in my middle school class, and it's just packed. And they're just great. Oh, wait a minute, I got another question here. Please do this more than once a year, says one question here. We usually have 3 a year. I don't know what the plan is for next year. That's up to my boss. But they're as much fun for me. I hope they're fun for you all. And like I said, if you have some ideas of something you'd like me to get, this is a little less history. It's history of innovation, but usually they're a little more history oriented. We were going to do originally the Beatles, and it just seemed to me that I was going to have a good time, but I wasn't sure how well that was going to go over. And so we decided to take the Musk thing and take it to another level and talk about a history of innovation in the United States. But thank you to everyone who's online for your support. And thank you for all of you who came out here tonight. And we hope to see you again soon. And please support your local Lafayette Academy.